PowerPoint ready. I don't know if that's so. Emma is from UWE in Bristol. Emma identified a gap in the field of the ecological impacts of artificial lighting and developed a novel field-based approach which demonstrated the first evidence of negative impacts of streetlights on bats. Emma's work provides insights into the effects of light disturbance on wildlife and suggests that the effects of disturbance on bats are species-specific and more complex than previously thought. Emma co-leads the UWE Bat Conservation Research Lab with Dr. Lintott, where she supervises PhD and master students and one postdoctoral researcher. Recent research highlights include revealing the importance of dark corridors for foraging bats and demonstrating the impacts of broad spectrum streetlights on insects. Emma has established an international bat research centre in Malawi, African bat conservation, part funded by Bat Conservation International, where she leads a team of 6 researchers. So, Emma, if you want to.
Thanks, Beth. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It's really exciting to be here talking about my favourite subject, bats and light pollution. So tonight I'm just going to go through some of the sort of summary evidence to give you an idea about the major impacts of lighting on bats. Okay, so as we know, we're all in a global biodiversity crisis, and the recent, well not recent, the fairly recent Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in 2002, aimed to try and reduce the rates of biodiversity loss by 2010. And unfortunately, we failed to do all of these. And as you can see in the image here, on the right, you can see some graphs which indicate all the indices which we failed to meet, which indicate our ability to try and reduce rates of biodiversity loss. So the wild bird index is basically the only one that's increasing. There are other ones, so the water bird population status index and the living planet index were all declining. So we failed to reduce the rates of biodiversity loss, meaning that we are in a biodiversity crisis. And we know that the key drivers of this biodiversity loss is population growth. And you can see that population growth has been substantial and is increasing exponentially ongoing, and is predicted to reach in excess of 10 billion by 2100. So it's an increasing problem that's not really going anywhere. But the real issue really is our rates of consumption, and global rates of consumption don't really match the rates of biodiversity loss. So you can see in this infographic here, top left is global biodiversity, global population growth. And all of these other images show you the indices of consumption, so water use, also paper consumption, fertilizer consumption, etc. They're all increasing substantially and much faster than population growth itself. So it's not the fact that we are lots of us, it's what we're doing whilst we're on the planet which is causing the problem. And as you can see here, quite interestingly, the rate of growth of McDonald's restaurants seems to be a very good indicator of our rates of consumption globally. So keep an eye on McDonald's and you'll know how they're faring. So we know the key drivers of biodiversity loss are these rates of consumption. So things like resource consumption, habitat loss, agricultural expansion, invasive alien species, nitrogen pollution, overexploitation, and climate change impacts. All of these things we know are driving biodiversity loss, and most of our research and our understanding is very much focused on these drivers, with very little attention focused until very recently on artificial lighting. But artificial lighting has been around for a very long time. You can see this picture here with Vincent van Gogh and Starry Night of the Rhone from 1888. And you can see in this picture all the images of the gas lamps at the time spilling light onto the Rhone, the local river. And this is in 1888. And if you look at this image today, well, 2008, fairly recently, you can see that it's not changed much apart from the spectrum of the lights, and in fact, arguably, perhaps more lighting. So lighting and artificial lighting of the nighttime environment has been around for a long time and has been a pervasive problem throughout history. And the problem is when you start to look globally, it's not really going away. And here you can see in this image of the global biodiversity hotspots. So the image that I highlighted in red are areas on the planet of the highest levels of local endemism and global biodiversity, called the biodiversity hotspots indicated by Conservation International. So this is where the majority of global biodiversity is in a global sense. And unfortunately, when you overlay this with maps of current levels of light pollution, there's a stark realization that where most of our biodiversity is also where the large areas of human population growth are occurring, and also where large levels of artificial lighting are increasing. And in fact, it's predicted that by 2030, 60% of global urbanization will occur within 50 kilometers of protected areas and inside hotspots. So it's a growing problem globally, and spatially it's occurring in the areas which we really would prefer it not to. So what is the issue with artificial lighting? Well, more recently, it has become an emerging research topic, and it's now ranked within the top 10 issues in biodiversity conservation. And it's a global phenomenon, so it impacts more than a quarter of the Earth's surface, and it's increasing, as I indicated. So year on year, we estimate there's around a 6% increase in global light pollution. For example, in England, only 11% of our sky is dark. So that's a substantial level of light pollution across the entire country. Previously, this has been quite overlooked as a source of biodiversity impact or biodiversity threat. And so currently it is an emerging topic. So what do we know about artificial light and wildlife? Well, we know that many animals have circadian clocks, which is this endogenous system that they use to regulate activity and physiology over 24-hour daily cycles. So they have these natural periodic cycles that are responsive to light. So they have daily cycles, seasonal cycles as a response to changes in day length, and monthly lunar cycles. And they use environmental cues to anticipate changes in temperature and humidity, and behavioural cues to trigger changes in activity, like reproduction and things like the tides. Also, lighting is a cue, so it triggers changes in their behaviour, whether they're breeding and hibernating, and causes phase shifts in species and their biology. So we know that animals are adapted to the sort of light-dark cycles that naturally occur in the environment. And when it comes to bats, we know that they're trophically diverse, they're obviously nocturnal. There's more in excess of 1,400 species globally, which accounts for a significant contribution to global biodiversity. They're over a fifth of all mammals, and they play really important ecological roles in the environment, including seed dispersal, pollination, and of course pest control, saving farmers in America in excess of 12 million per year. So this high trophic and niche diversity means that they're really good bioindicators. We can use them to understand what's happening in the environment. And because they're nocturnal, they make really good indicators of the status and the health of the nocturnal night environment. So what do we know about how lighting impacts bats? Well, I'm going to run through some of the key sort of summary headline impacts that we're aware of, focusing on roosting, commuting, and foraging behaviour. So starting with roosting, we know that roosts are really important to bats. They're really important for their population survival. They use them for breeding, they use them for feeding and foraging, and of course in sort of temperate zones, they use them for hibernation. So maintaining roosts and protecting roosts has long been a key focus in bat conservation, as Joe will, I'm sure, be aware of. And of course, it's important that we understand impacts on roosts to be able to then predict any potential impacts at the population level. So what we do know from the impacts of lighting on roosts and bats in roosts is that it can delay emergence behaviour. So evidence for that is mainly from studies with pipistrelle bats. So common pips have been shown to have reduced numbers of bats emerging when external lighting spills onto the exits. And also we know that extended twilight delays emergence with lesser horseshoe bats. So we know that this sort of lighting around the external outside of the roosts can impact what time they leave. And that's really important because if they leave too late, then they can have reduced times for foraging, which means they have to offset that by foraging longer. We also know there's some limited evidence of impacts on reproductive success. So studies on myotis bats found that buildings that were lit externally had individuals that had lower juvenile growth rates. So the young were a lot smaller in buildings that were externally lit than the young in those unlit areas. So those studies need to be augmented a bit more. We don't know that much more about how lighting impacts reproductive success, but we know that anything that may potentially have an impact on fitness is going to be of significant concern to bats. Perhaps more alarmingly is the evidence for avoidance of roosts and roost abandonment and even mortality. So, for example, a study of Myotis marginatus showed that a maternity roost of around 1,000 females was abandoned as light spilled just onto the entrance. So that's quite a significant negative impact for bats. They're avoiding going into their roost, they abandon it. And we know that roosts, particularly maternity roosts, are really important for bats because they use them for breeding. And they have really high fidelity, so they'll return to the same roost year on year. And perhaps more alarmingly is a high mortality event that's been recorded in Germany by Karl Kugelschaffer. He found that when a light was left on inside a roost accidentally for a period of 2 days, on return, the roost visitor found that over 1,000 bats had died. So they'd failed to emerge from the roost because the lights were left on in the roost for 2 days. So that's quite a severe negative impact, of course, could have long-term effects on colony survivals. Also, we know that we can have reduced numbers, so bats will avoid the roost. So both evidence for non-UK species, Myotis lucifugus and Eptiscus fuscus, well, that is a UK species, fuscus, declined by between 50 to 90% and 40 to 96% after lights were installed inside the roost. So this is obviously a significant impact again, because you're forcing bats away from their really important breeding roosts. We also know that there are impacts on commuting behaviour. So commuting roosts are really important for some, commuting routes, are really important for some bats, because certain bat species try to avoid flying in the open and they're not adapted to fly high in open areas. So they'll tend to hug hedges or linear features to navigate through the landscape. And it's these bats which have been shown to be negatively impacted by lighting along commuting routes. So previous studies have found that lesser horseshoe bats and Myotis bats avoid their commuting routes when they're illuminated with high pressure sodium and LED lights. And lesser horseshoe bats avoid commuting routes when they're also illuminated with red lights, green lights, and white LED lights as well. Interestingly, no effects were found for sort of the big bats, Eptiscus nicholas and the pipistrelle species. Also, we know that you can have reduced activity, and so impacts on ranging behaviour have been evidenced. Again, some of these are non-UK species, but still it shows the relative impacts of lighting on bats, where we found that 36 times more activity of Nyctophilus gouldi was found in unlit dark areas compared to lit areas. So they're much more likely to be found in dark areas compared to lit areas. Also, activity of serotine bats was reduced, and Myotis bats was reduced within close proximity of high pressure sodium lights. And throughout their foraging range, greater horseshoe bats were found to avoid lit areas from radio tracking studies. And we also know that local densities of high pressure sodium and LED lights have negative effects on common pips compared to unlit areas, which is quite surprising, but this has occurred at a landscape level. Previous studies have shown the opposite for LED lights and high pressure sodium lights with pips. But overall, in terms of commuting and ranging behaviour there, we know that the avoidance and reduced activity impacts result in sort of reduced landscape connectivity for bats. So lighting is creating barriers to movement and ranging behaviour, which is a significant negative impact. For some species, though, ranging behaviour can be impacted in a different way. So there is some evidence of increased activity for some species, and these tend to be those species that are fast flyers, that are more generalist species, that are adapted for more open environments. So some studies have shown that common pips are more active at green lights compared to control studies, and also that Pipistrellus cooley was increased within 10 metres of lit high pressure sodium lights. Also, a study that we did in Cornwall a few years back showed that we had higher activity levels of common pips and Nyctophilus species at ceramic halide lights compared to low pressure lights. So this was a kind of controlled design where they were switching lights from low pressure sodium to ceramic metal halides, and we found increased numbers of pipistrelles and Nyctophilus when they switched over to the new light type. So in contrast to the other studies which have found negative effects, there are some studies that are showing increased or attractive effects for certain species to certain light types. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a positive effect, because this can also alter the community composition of bats and their insect prey. So there's lots more complicated knock-on effects from attracting species to certain light types. So we also know that there are light-specific responses that can also complicate this issue. So previous studies have also found that common pips are 45% lower in activity at LED, white LED lights, compared to mercury vapor lights. And the same was found for myotis bats, so lower levels of activity at LED versus mercury vapor. And that's generally believed to be a function of the sort of white and the UV content of mercury vapor lights. Mercury vapor lights tend to be really high intensity as well, so they have high lux levels associated with them. And they have UV content, which attracts insect prey, which may indicate as to why you're getting lower levels of LEDs compared to the mercury vapors. As I said already as well, we found light-specific differences between ceramic metal halide and low-pressure sodium, with pips being more common at ceramic metal halide. And interestingly, for some differences, we found there's no difference. Some studies found there's no differences between species and also between different light types. So mercury vapor and LED, they found no difference in activity for Nethusius pips, soprano pips, Nycteris septicus as well. So there seems to be a mixed message with the light types, and it's also clearly species specific. So in summary, it's a really complex situation, which is probably not good news for anyone out there who's working in ecology or bat conservation and mitigation, because there's no sort of one solution fits all. What we do know is that lighting can affect a full range of bat behaviours, from general activity to ranging behaviour, commuting behaviour, also breeding and roost use. We know that negative impacts can include roost avoidance and general spatial avoidance, roost abandonment, habitat fragmentation, so stopping bats from flying from their roost to their foraging grounds, for example, and potentially reduced breeding success, all of which can have knock-on fitness effects, which could be negative for bats long term. And we also know that responses are varied. So you'll see from the results I showed you there that the differences in how bats respond are very much a function of their behaviour, so what they're doing at the time, whether they're feeding, foraging or roosting, the species themselves. Some of it can be site specific, depending on what the resources are and availability around that site, how many roosts are available, etc. And also, of course, they're specific to the light type and the light intensity. So it's not that simple of a situation. But there are some general rules of thumb, which is a good thing to go home with. There are, in terms of the species-specific impacts, species tend to respond in accordance with their behavioural adaptations. So a rule of thumb generally is that those species that are more adapted for foraging in cluttered environments and are slow flyers are more likely to be negatively impacted by lighting, as a general rule of thumb. And some species avoid light even at low levels, and to date have been shown to avoid all types of light, for example, lesser horseshoe bats. In terms of light types, we do know that it's the blue-white end of the spectrum, and particularly anything containing UV, which have stronger effects, and those can be positive and negative on bats and insects. And we do know that red lights tend to cause no or little effects on activity of most bat species studied, apart from the lesser horseshoe bats, who still avoid red light as well. So in summary there's no panacea for the light types, and there's no panacea for a specific solution. But the take-home message really is the importance of trying to reduce light overall. Dark corridors for all bat species and for all wildlife is the best way forward. So it's about thinking about whether the light is needed in the first place and directing it in the right place, which Jo is going to talk about. So reducing and avoiding lighting all areas, and particularly trying to avoid using blue-white light end of the spectrum if possible. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Emma. So now we've got Jo from the Bat Conservation Trust talking. Jo has worked at the Bat Conservation Trust for the last 5.5 years, first as the Built Environment Officer before becoming the Built Environment Manager in early 2019. Prior to starting at the BCT, she has been involved with bat conservation in a voluntary and professional capacity for over 17 years. Jo's more recent professional experience as an ecological consultant and licensed bat worker specialising in urban bat ecology, providing surveys, mitigation and enhancement advice covering a range of development projects, including residential, commercial and transport. She also has an extensive experience in research, in scientific research, working for the Australian Research Centre for Urban Ecology and Earthwatch in Melbourne, and is now running trapping surveys for the National Nathiesis Pipistrelle project in South London. Jo is a full member of SIEM and volunteer Bat Roost visitor and a member of London Bat Group.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Beth. And thanks, Emma. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see there's so much interest this evening in this topic. And I think, as you can see from what Emma outlined, not just that this is a pressing issue for our bats, but you know, for the environment as a whole. So I'm going to give you an overview now of the best practice guidance that the Bat Conservation Trust produces with industry representatives such as the Institution for Lighting Professionals, and some of the mitigation measures that might be appropriate and available to some of the species out there, depending on the development site. Now, although this is, from my background, industry focused, hopefully you'll be able to see some of the take homes that you'll be able to apply to your own gardens or green spaces or any of the areas that you manage. But equally, I think, you know, it really helps us as a conservation charity have eyes and ears on the ground, keeping an eye out for issues with lighting and sort of empowering you really to challenge where you see poor lighting and to find, you know, use those resources that are freely available to you to be able to ask the right questions. You can never have enough bat champions out there sort of fighting their corner, really. So to start off with, some of the resources on our website. So we have an artificial lighting guidance page, and on that page is the latest best practice guidance document for industry, which is bats and the artificial lighting in the UK. And it's a joint publication between us and the Institution of Lighting Professionals. It's free to download, and why it does sound very technical, it's broken down into a section on research, which is a lot of the stuff that Emma's already covered. Then there's a section about the technology, so just understanding what you know we're talking about, some of the terminology, so a glossary as well for that, some of the lighting types, and then the last section is a focus on different kinds of mitigation that you can use, and the process really that development should be going through when they're thinking about lighting. And another nice document that complements that, which isn't about bats, but it is about, as it says, getting it right, is about domestic exterior lighting, and that's another free to download, and you can get that from the Institute of Lighting Professionals webpage, but all links to all of this will be in the resource pack as well. And that's just a really nice document about how do we prevent light spill on a daily basis, even if we're not thinking about necessarily a bat's going to be impacted. I think we all know that feeling of light trespass, the damage it can do to the local environment, things like dark skies. So that's just a really nice document, a kind of a how-to if you need to light, and that's the next bit we'll step on to. How do you do this mindfully and properly, thinking about the environment? So this is the kind of process that we would normally go through as an ecological consultant, that we would take our clients through, but it still stands, you know, as just a really nice way to emphasize what we should be doing as best practice every day, thinking about protecting the environment from the impacts of light pollution. And you'll notice right at the very top there, we tend to say, we talk about mitigation and mitigation measures, but the very first thing we should be doing, and I should say this is the mitigation hierarchy, and it's, you know, sort of the basis for how we make assessments in how to protect ecology, not just from lighting, but from any impacts from a development. And avoidance is the top headline there. And as Emma's already said, you know, if you don't need to use lighting, the best thing for our bats is to avoid it. You know, some of our bat species, when you think about the rate of change that Emma's highlighted over just the last 50 years, for example, some of our bat species, there are fossil records that have come out of Eastern Europe showing, from 35 million years ago, showing exactly the same bats that we have around today. So if they've been perfectly adapted for darkness for that long, think about how difficult it is for them even potentially to try and adapt to a little bit of lighting. And you know, we've already heard some bats just cannot adapt, and it causes really severe impacts. So first port of call, does a habitat need to be lit at all? Really being mindful about having lighting in the right place for the right reasons. You know, it's quite common to see whole green spaces, whole gardens fully lit, when actually maybe the lighting is only needed on the footpath, or maybe the lighting is only needed by the back door, so people are accessing, you know, the property at night. So first thing to think about is, do we need the lighting at all? Okay, if we do need the lighting, we decide it's essential. There are issues to do with safety and access. What type of lighting should we put in place? And as Emma has outlined, any lighting with a sort of UV rich or blue content is particularly harmful. So thinking about using lighting on the warmer end of the spectrum. Does the lighting need to be on all the time? There's a lot of really, you know, issues with LEDs, because people are finding that for a lot less money and a lot less energy, they can get a lot brighter output. However, LEDs are tools, and they're as good as what we put in. So the good thing about LEDs is they can be dimmed. You can fit triggering mechanisms. They come in warmer, sort of spectrums of light. So thinking about the type of lighting if it has to go in, and running down this sort of mitigation hierarchy. Worst case scenario, we can't avoid lighting an area. Well, then actually the compensation, that is where the real costs come in. If you have rare species and you have areas that we're saying have to be lit, well, then those species still have to be protected, and that habitat still has to be considered. And this is where you might be, as a developer, asked to do some quite significant habitat compensation, and that's where the costs come in. And so although we're looking to protect bats, as part of this process, we're also looking to improve the development process. We're not looking to cause delays. We're not looking to cause issues. And the best way to do that is to really think about avoidance at the start, and then working your way to the more expensive compensation. Now, that's how we look at it in terms of developments. But if you were using that to reflect upon a small green space that you managed, or even your own garden, again, avoidance, it's all about good site layout. It's all about considering where bats might be, where habitat for bats that is important might be. And this is taken from our guidance, and it shows a zonation approach in Bath, where you have fantastic habitat right through the centre of a city. It's a really nice example. And so right next to where you have the river and you have darker areas, you have our greater and lesser horseshoes commuting through the city. That is a dark protected corridor that should have no light falling across it. And as you move further away from the protected and important habitats, the light levels slowly rise to areas where there's very little habitat and there's less impact to those rarer species. But you could shrink that approach down to your own garden, your own green space, and look and think, where are those dark green corridors that should be protected? Or does your garden back onto something like a canal or a railway line, somewhere that if light was to fall onto it, it might cause impacts to our bat species? But again, light spill in general should be avoided. It is a nuisance. And so being more mindful about cut-offs on our lights, and I'll talk about the kind of things that you can do to the actual light fitting in a minute, is bringing that zone of lighting into exactly where it's needed and avoiding that spill onto those more protected and important habitats. Now, some of those habitats are dark green corridors, others might be really good foraging areas for bats. So water bodies, even small ponds, anywhere in the garden where you've got insects gathering. We've already sort of discussed how good bats are at pest suppression. Don't do the work that you don't have to. Bring the bats into the garden, get them to eat the mosquitoes. This is moving back to this more natural approach. It's good for everybody, basically. So being mindful in your own green space about what can you protect and keep dark and what might need lighting. And I'm quite often asked about things like how do I make my way through the garden? I need lighting for steps and things like that. So where you do need lighting, think about the type of lighting that's going in, where the light is shining, and what its purpose is really. Right at the bottom, I mentioned subtle waymarking rather than full illumination, and I've been to some really nice development sites where instead of having lights from above lighting the path in front of you, you're having really low lights right at your feet, and what they're doing is providing a directional sort of approach. You're looking for the next way to go, not looking at everything that's in front of you. And this does obviously rely on having well maintained paths and developments that you know, are careful about change of levels and steps and things like that. But your eyes adjust very quickly, and before you know it, you realize you're making your way through a site with very little lighting that's protecting the wildlife around you. So it is about being mindful, and it's about being thoughtful about potentially taking innovative approaches. Talking again about the warm white LEDs, there's a good example there of right at the other end of that spectrum of this red lighting, and we talked about different spectras of lighting, but it doesn't have to be necessarily as intense as that. We're just talking about something without that UV blue rich content. 0% upward light output, I mean, it's just common sense. Light shouldn't be shining upwards into the sky. It's a waste of energy. It causes sky glow. It's damaging to dark skies. It's damaging to our wildlife. So again, just really taking a moment to think about where you want that light to go, and to look at where the light is shining. If there's issues again with light spilling out of the fitting potentially directional hoods or shields. Again, it's security lighting on really short timers, and making sure it just, you know, isn't as bright as it needs to be. There's a lot of lighting out there and a lot of light fittings that are way beyond what are really needed for day to day. So again, doing a bit of research, and being mindful about what you're putting in. You'll just want a light to come on quickly if you're coming in and out of, you know, providing access maybe to your property. The difficulty with some of the security lightings that's really bright as well, not just you're getting light spill into the environment and you're getting glare, but also we can struggle with that transition between light and dark, and there's issues with security to do with sharp cut-offs of light, where there's bright light and I mean, we've all been in those situations where you're in a pool of light and you can't really see what's going on around you. So all of this is, you know, a lot of it is common sense as well. Although we are talking about bats and protecting bats, we're also talking about protecting the environment and creating a safer environment as well. You know, bollards and low level lighting can be an option, but it's about thinking about the light levels and the brightness. Any bright lights at a very low level can still create glare, and you get that sort of reflection of light back up into the environment. So I mean, all of these can be used as options little by little to sort of reduce the amount of lighting that we're putting into our green spaces and around our buildings. And you know, we're talking a lot about the external facades and the environment outside, because we're thinking about bats and because we're thinking about the environment. But obviously, you know, issues from light pollution can come from inside the building as well. And it's really important to think about, again, not just what do we need for sitting inside a room, but how is that impacting the environment outside. There's a range of things you can do with light fittings that can actually reduce yet again that impact that we're having. Moving light fittings, especially if you've got a new development, you're redesigning a room, or you're moving stuff around, moving light away from a window, recessing some of those fittings so they're not hanging down into the room and the light's going out the window, but you're getting light where you need it. Thinking about the other ways that you can protect the environment from some of that light spill. So some developments are designed with balconies that are solid and will actually block some of that light spill. Some people will choose to build, you know, hedges and planting. The difficulty with that kind of thing is to do with stuff like maintenance, and I'll talk about in a minute some of the common pitfalls and issues that we might see with some of these mitigation measures that aren't fully thought through, or where we might potentially have maintenance issues as well. So that's one of the issues, is quite often is a design of site, a concept of site, and then that passing on to somebody else in terms of management and who lives in a particular building. So a lot of the time it's a great way to design out some of these issues before they're even an issue, and a lot of the stuff we're looking at here are the kind of things that would go into architects' drawings at the start of a development. But that doesn't mean we can't think on a day-to-day basis about how maybe we could fold some of those into you know, our own homes. Security lighting, again, you can just see on the drawing there, you're really only looking for lighting to come and go from the premise, and yet you'll see whole gardens lit up and things like that just by a light coming on. And sometimes it's people, and sometimes it's been woken up in the middle of the night by foxes. And so again, you know, these don't do anybody any favors. So yeah, just a little bit of thought, and you can really start to see how we can all sort of do our bit in terms of controlling for some of these impacts. And so what are some of the common lighting pitfalls? Probably won't surprise you. Yeah, the main one tends to be skipping straight to mitigation. There's a big issue in general thinking about developments, which is that bats are costly, bats cause delays, bats cause issues with developments, when actually this isn't strictly true. I mean, we, you know, here tonight have a lot of expertise in dealing with bats and developments. There's a lot of advice out there. There's a lot of fantastic ecological consultants, but there's only so much you can do as a consultant to help a development if you're brought in partway through the process. Having experts like lighting engineers and ecologists on at the start of a project, or in, you know, for example, in doing work to your own house, you know, seeking advice at the very start of the outset of design process and talking to the architect saves you a lot of headaches further down the line. If you skip over thinking about avoiding putting lighting in and moving straight to mitigation, it will always be more costly. If you move past that and decide you definitely need lighting without really considering all the options, then the compensation end is even more costly. So really, thinking about whether you need lighting at the very start of any project is the best way to avoid headaches, to avoid redesigns, to avoid issues with the development coming up against planning, because you will be, you know, asked as a planning application, where, especially if you're near protected sites with some of our rarer species. And I talked about Bath earlier in the common and the lesser and greater horseshoes, you will be asked whether these have been considered as part of the planning application. Don't leave yourself in a situation like that. Get advice at the very start of the project. There's a lot of, you know, not doing good research into lighting types, or taking that research from, you know, from good quality lighting engineers and people like the Institution of Lighting Professionals, you know, who are well versed in this topic and are a great place to go for people who will really understand, you know, the type of products that you want and what you're asking for in terms of a design. There are a lot of poor products out there, and the term eco is slapped on a lot of things these days, and really would advise you doing a little bit of research before you buy any lighting and just seeing what's out there. And like I say, looking at issues to do with dimming and how bright the levels of lighting are and the quality of light first, before buying something that's too bright and then trying to retrofit things like cowls and hoods and directional sort of controls, which, being physical, even with a bright light, if that physical barrier sometimes isn't enough, and you still might get spill and glare. Again, one of the issues with controlling for internal lighting is if you already have designed a building that is mostly glass on one side, it's going to be very costly and difficult to then put in things like controlled for blinds. There's some very expensive glazing that can be used to block out lighting. Again, thinking about where those windows are, do they shine straight onto habitat that might be important for bats? Doing that design work at the start of any project, really. I talked a little bit about using screening, and it might be appropriate in some areas, especially if you've got a site where you've got long-term maintenance guaranteed, it's been managed by a bigger organisation, but things like hedgerows and stuff can be removed quite easily. So we would normally recommend something like a good solid fence, something that you knew would be a barrier that would stay there and sort of protect any habitat behind it. But essentially, what we're really saying is just be mindful of what you're doing on site at the start of any project, you know, big or small. Doing your research, you know, there's a lot of good advice out there. There's a lot of free advice, and there's a good information pack coming around. And the other side of this is, if you think other people aren't doing this, I've definitely seen developments who have quoted our guidance, and yet when you look at what is actually going in for lighting, no consideration has been made for bats at all. You know, if you're concerned that things are going on in your local area where the environment isn't being considered, we also have a great planning and development pack, which will help you look at planning applications for the whole range of issues to do with bats, but lighting is just one of them, which we have extra resources for. And really, it helps us as a conservation charity with limited resources to empower you guys out there to protect our bats and the local environment. And that's kind of my big plea today. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the topic, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the kind of things that you can do and the kind of things to keep your eye out for. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jo. So I think now we'll go to the Q&A with everyone. So yeah, if you want to add your questions to the chat box, or you can press the button, raise your hand up, and we'll get round to you. I know we've got a couple of questions already. So I'll read out the first one. So I was wondering if the effects of light pollution on bats could be linked with the amount of daylight exposure for different species. For instance, species that are open roosting, such as flying foxes, might not be affected much by the increasing nocturnal light relative to the cave roosting species. That was for Emma. Sorry, I forgot to say that.
Phew.
This theory has come up before, actually, but in some cases it sort of bears out, in other cases it doesn't. So there is, for example, some experimental work that's been done with fruit bats and how lighting, there's been some cage experiments, some like lab-based experiments where bats have been put into enclosures, and they've done sort of controlled trials. And in fact, fruit bats are also equally as impacted, or this species was at least, by lighting in their environment when they're trying to forage, as much as sort of other dark roosting species per se. And of course, fruit bats use vision to orientate at night, and also smell to determine their fruits, but not always. So certain fruits might be identified by sight as well as smell. So I think, yeah, it's kind of a complicated one. There's no sort of overwhelming evidence to say that's the case at the present. So that's how I'm going to leave that one.
Okay, we've got another one from, I think, Alex. Does the literature suggest why lesser horseshoes are particularly sensitive to artificial light at night? What sets them apart from other species?
So horseshoes, the main sort of theory that we're going with horseshoes is the fact that it's anti-predatory type behaviour, and also that it's due to their echolocation adaptation. So they're adapted for flying in really cluttered environments. They're a very small bat, they fly really slow, very low to the ground. When they fly, you kind of think, how are they even doing this? Because they're a bit kind of like, pootling around very close to the ground. You feel like you could just almost pick them out of the air. And that allows them to be very efficient in a really cluttered, dense environment, such as a dense woodland, so that they don't collide with trees and leaves and all the rest of it, and that they can glean stuff as well off undersides of leaves, etc. But equally, that means they're not very good at evading aerial predation. So they, it's related to a lot of things: their aspect ratio, their body size, and also their emergence time. So they emerge a lot later to avoid any nocturnal any predators that come out at dusk. But equally, their echolocation as well is quite defined. So they have very good detail. So they can, because they're CF bats, so they can see things in good detail, but they can't see very far. So in terms of their ability to evade predators, they really are reliant on being in those dense environments. So they are these sort of hedge-hugging bats. And so that's the theory, is that to avoid being predated in those environments, and because they're not strong flyers, so you got to get away as quickly. So that's the anti-predatory theory for horseshoe bats particularly. But they are surprisingly light averse. Not that I really like that term, but of all the bats, when the research comes out showing that they even avoid the red light, that's quite surprising, So yeah, they really do not like it.
We've got another one in the chat. This is for Jo. My town has all white UV lights. What could I do on a ground level other than writing to the local MP to try and get warmer lighting?
First of all, it depends what sort of spectrum that white lighting is. It might have a UV content, it might not. Some of the white lighting that we're seeing doesn't have a UV content, even though it appears fairly white. So it would be worth asking the question of the local planning authority, and trying to work out, you know, is it an area where the lighting has to be on all the time? Is there a question? There are certainly places that are trialing things like part night lighting and turning off lighting overnight in particular areas. That can still be an issue for bats, though, unfortunately, because the lighting tends to turn off like a little way after dusk and come on a little way before dawn, which is the time when we're not active, but there's still lighting at that sort of peak time when bats are coming and going from their roosts, and when you've got that big upswell of insects after dusk. So part night lighting is certainly not the sort of cure-all for bats necessarily, but it can reduce light pollution. Yeah, worth talking to local planning authority and sending things like the guidance and saying, are there other options? It tends to be there'll be a rollout of all of this tech all in one go, and maybe there's no consultation, or there's not even any thought for, is this next to a park? Is that, you know, has any thought been made for where this lighting is going in? And sometimes there can be, especially if there's an ecologist on the you know, local planning authority as well, there are discussions to be had about whether lighting needs to be on all the time. It has to be done in consultation. Nobody's suggesting we just go around and turn off lighting without asking anybody, because that causes a whole load of other issues for bat conservation in terms of hearts and minds. But sometimes it's just not a question anybody's thought to ask anyone. And it's worth reading through the guidance, sending the guidance ahead of time, and just seeing if there's anybody who's willing to have those conversations locally. Local LPA ecologist would be a good place to start.
And also to Emma, yes, the recording will be available. We're gonna, I think, either put it on YouTube or send you a link, so you will be able to get it. So Caroline's got her hand up.
Thank you. I just didn't know how to type it out quick enough. You mentioned that during the planning stages, when they're building, they can make accommodations for light reduction or light pollution reduction, and that it's better to do it in the planning stages than it is to mitigate it later. But what is the reverse of that, or the longevity of those plans? So when someone takes over the property, whether it be commercial or personal, and they then upgrade or make renovations that does not make these considerations, is there a follow-up? Like, is there a monitoring process? Like, once something has been established as an environmental habitat, that then it'll be kept an eye on, and it'll be mentioned to them that you're actually having a negative impact?
That can depend on the setup, really. So for some development sites where, and there's a really good point, and one that we're wrangling with at the moment in terms of, we're updating the current guidance note, and one of the things that we want to do is emphasize, how do we get these this mitigation put in perpetuity, and it's a really difficult issue. Some development sites where it will have this almost like a sort of a covenant on the house as well. There's only certain levels of lighting that you're allowed to put in. This does rely on checks and compliance, but it will be moving onto the estate and signing particular contracts. I've had a lot of toing and froing about this. Do you have a whole site with very, very little lighting, hope that nobody comes on and buys these really bright security lights that are very cheap, very easy to get from any of our local DIY stores, whack them up and nobody notices them, or there's no compliance? Or do you, as a development, decide to put on things like security lighting that you have control over? So you've provided something that you think people will put in anyway, and potentially a point of most damage, putting in some of these really bright security lights that can be on all night. Do you go ahead and put something on the building already that is very quick triggered, is exactly where you want it? You know there's no spill on adjacent habitats, it's not got a UV content. I'm not saying there's a correct answer to this, but certainly we've had discussions about what do you leave it to, because one of the biggest issues, like you rightly say, and this isn't just with lighting, it's across the board, is compliance. You can put planning conditions in, those conditions can be signed off, but when you have a handover of site, how good is that handover? Where is the information that this is the reason these are particular lights are used? If for bats, that kind of stuff can be lost really easily. So some of it is about, how do we design, or how do we provide recommendations to design in sites that have that lighting protection in the best way possible for as long as possible. And that's something we're wrangling with, basically, is the long short answer of that. It's a really good point. You know, providing no lighting doesn't mean that that site is going to have no lighting. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
We've got another one here from Claire. What should you consider for temporary lighting, such as for festivals or camping?
Are we talking taking to festivals and camping, or provide a lot of big style festivals? Yeah, I mean, the kind of lighting I'm asked about for gardens, for example, like for the summer, like small amounts of lighting in a garden to make it more usable. Again, think about there's a lot of sort of solar lights out there that are very, very low level, that don't give out a lot of brightness, especially for things like paths and stuff like that. We quite get often asked by glamping sites in the middle of the countryside, like, how can we just make sure that we don't have our patrons wandering off into the dark and getting lost? You know, thinking about if what you're after is just something to provide a little bit of light to find your way back to the tent, you know, there are plenty of good low level solar lights out there that were only on for that period just after dark when you're moving across the site or out in the garden, and then they're off for the rest of the night. So if you must use lighting, just think about how you can get away with using as little lighting as possible for doing the job that you want to do.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions if anyone has any. I don't know if anyone has. Okay, well, if not, I hope you guys have found tonight useful and enjoyable. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Joe and Emma and Bristol Nature Network. And we'll be sending out the info packs later on tonight to kind of remind you of how to help, and the recording as well. So thank you everyone for coming. See you later.